The wind howled across the empty plains of Wyoming in the winter of 1887, rattling the loose boards of the lonely ranch house that sat miles away from the nearest town, a place where the horizon stretched forever and silence could swallow a man whole. And inside that worn wooden house lived a cowboy named Daniel Cross, a man who had once been known across the territory as fearless, stubborn, and harder than the land itself, but now he lived alone with nothing but his horses, his cattle, and memories he never spoke about, because years earlier he had buried the only family he ever had after a brutal fever swept through the frontier town he once called home. And since that day Daniel had chosen a life of solitude, believing the land was easier to deal with than people, believing cattle didn't betray you and storms didn't lie, and most folks in town said Daniel Cross was a good man but a broken one, the kind who kept to himself, rode into town once a month for supplies, and disappeared back into the mountains before sunset. And that cold evening Daniel was returning from town with a wagon of feed when he noticed something strange near the abandoned stage stop by the old cottonwood trees, a flicker of movement where no one should have been, and at first he thought maybe it was a stray horse or some traveler passing through, but when he guided his wagon closer he saw a young woman sitting on the frozen ground beside a worn suitcase, her dress thin against the brutal wind, her hair tangled by dust and snow, and her eyes carrying the kind of fear that only comes from being completely alone in a world that doesn't care whether you live or die. And Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop, his instincts telling him to keep riding because trouble often came dressed in helplessness on the frontier, but something about the way the woman looked at him made him pause, and when he climbed down from the wagon and asked what she was doing out here alone the woman hesitated as if unsure whether to trust him, before quietly saying she had been left behind, and Daniel frowned because people didn't just get left behind in the middle of nowhere unless something had gone terribly wrong, so he asked who left her and why. And the woman lowered her eyes before explaining that her name was Clara Whitmore and she had arrived from back east as a mail-order bride, promised to a rancher who had written letters for months swearing he wanted a wife, a partner, someone to build a future with on the frontier. But when Clara stepped off the stagecoach that morning and the man finally saw her in person he laughed in front of everyone in town and said she wasn't the woman he expected, that she looked plain and tired and far different from the picture she had sent, and then he turned around and rode away, leaving her standing alone while the townsfolk whispered and stared, and Clara's voice trembled as she spoke those words because humiliation can wound deeper than hunger or cold, and Daniel felt something shift inside his chest as he listened because he had seen cruelty before but never that kind of cowardice, and when Clara finished her story she added that she didn't know where to go because she had spent her last money to reach the frontier and there was no family waiting for her anywhere, so she had walked until the town disappeared behind her and ended up here by the old stage stop, unsure what to do next, and Daniel stood there quietly while the wind blew dust across the road, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because the frontier had taught him that helping someone often meant inviting problems into your life, yet leaving her there felt wrong in a way he couldn't ignore, and finally he sighed and said she couldn't stay out here or the cold would kill her before morning, so she could ride with him back to his ranch for the night until she figured out what to do, and Clara looked surprised as if she expected another rejection. But she nodded slowly and gathered her suitcase, climbing into the wagon beside him as the horses started moving again across the darkening plains, and the ride back to the ranch was quiet except for the creaking wheels and the distant howl of coyotes echoing through the hills, and Daniel occasionally glanced at Clara to make sure she hadn't frozen in the bitter air, while she stared at the endless horizon wondering how her life had unraveled so quickly in a single day, and when they finally reached the ranch house the lantern light glowed warmly against the snow, making it look almost welcoming despite its age and rough edges, and Daniel helped her down from the wagon before leading her inside where the fire still burned low in the stone hearth, and Clara wrapped her hands around the warmth as if she hadn't felt heat in days, while Daniel quietly prepared coffee and bread without asking questions, because he had learned long ago that sometimes people needed kindness more than conversation, and as the night deepened Clara slowly began to talk about the life she left behind in a small town in Ohio, where opportunities for women were scarce and marriage was often the only path forward, which was why she answered the advertisement from the rancher who promised a new beginning out west, and Daniel listened silently while staring into the fire, remembering how hope can drive people to cross entire continents chasing a future that may never exist, and after a while Clara asked him why he lived alone so far from town, and Daniel hesitated before admitting that he once had a wife and a little boy but lost them to illness many years ago. And since then the ranch had been the only thing keeping him moving forward, because when a man spends too much time around people he risks caring again, and caring always comes with a price on the frontier, and Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she simply thanked him for letting her stay the night and promised she would leave in the morning so she wouldn't burden him any longer, but Daniel shrugged and said the ranch was big enough for 2 people for a while, and she could help with chores until she decided where to go next. And Clara looked uncertain yet grateful because for the first time since arriving out west someone had treated her like a human being instead of a mistake. And outside the storm grew stronger as snow began falling across the empty plains, sealing the ranch in a blanket of white while inside the lonely cowboy and the abandoned bride sat quietly by the fire, unaware that the strange twist of fate that brought them together on that freezing night would soon change both of their lives in ways neither of them could possibly imagine, because sometimes the frontier doesn't just test a person's strength, it quietly places 2 broken souls on the same path and waits to see whether they will remain strangers or become the family neither of them ever expected to find again. And as the fire crackled and the storm raged outside, Daniel Cross realized something he hadn't felt in years, the faint and unfamiliar presence of hope returning to a heart that had long believed it was meant to live and die alone. Morning arrived slowly across the frozen plains, the pale winter sun rising behind distant mountains while the ranch stood quiet beneath a blanket of fresh snow. And inside the small wooden house Clara Whitmore woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifting through the air, a scent so simple yet comforting that for a moment she forgot everything that had happened the day before, but as her memories returned she sat up slowly, realizing she was still in the home of the lonely cowboy who had rescued her from the bitter cold, and when she stepped into the main room she saw Daniel Cross standing near the window pulling on his heavy coat, his broad shoulders outlined by the golden morning light as he prepared to start another long day of work on the ranch, because life on the frontier never paused for sorrow or confusion, and when he noticed Clara he simply nodded and pushed a warm cup of coffee toward her without a word, yet there was something different in the air between them now, something quieter and less distant than the night before, as if the storm outside had somehow broken a wall that Daniel had built around his heart for years, and Clara thanked him softly before sitting at the small wooden table, still unsure how to act in this strange new place where she was both a guest and a stranger. But Daniel told her she didn't need to rush away like she had promised the night before because the storm had buried the roads and traveling anywhere today would be nearly impossible, and if she truly wanted to help around the ranch there was always work to be done, chores that never ended whether a person was ready for them or not. And Clara nodded with determination because she refused to remain helpless again, she refused to be the woman who waited for others to decide her fate. So that morning she followed Daniel outside into the cold bright world where the ranch spread across the snowy valley like a stubborn outpost against the wilderness, and although the work was harder than anything she had ever done before she pushed herself through it, hauling water, feeding the horses, and helping repair a broken fence while Daniel watched quietly from a distance, surprised by the strength hiding behind her gentle appearance. And over the next few days a routine slowly formed between them as Clara learned the rhythm of ranch life while Daniel found himself speaking more than he had in years, explaining how to saddle a horse, how to read the sky for approaching storms, and how the land itself could become either a friend or an enemy depending on how you treated it. And for the first time since losing his family Daniel began to feel the heavy silence of his ranch lifting little by little, replaced by the quiet presence of someone who didn't judge him for the ghosts he carried. Yet the peace they found did not go unnoticed for long, because news travels quickly in small frontier towns, and only a week after Clara arrived at the ranch a group of riders appeared on the distant road one afternoon, their silhouettes dark against the snow as they approached the property, and when Daniel stepped outside with a cautious hand resting near his revolver he immediately recognized the man leading them, the very rancher who had humiliated Clara in town and left her behind like unwanted baggage, a man named Harold Briggs who was known across the territory not for kindness but for arrogance and greed. And Harold rode up with a smirk on his face as if the entire situation amused him, claiming he had come to retrieve his bride, now that he realized losing her might damage his reputation among the townsfolk. But Clara's heart pounded with fear and anger because she knew the truth behind those words. She knew Harold did not want a wife, he wanted control and appearances, and Daniel stood silently between them while the cold wind blew across the ranch yard, his calm expression hiding the storm rising inside him as he listened to Harold speak as if Clara were nothing more than property he had misplaced. And when Harold finally demanded she return with him Daniel's voice came out low and steady as he said Clara was free to make her own decision because no man owned her future, and Harold laughed at that idea before looking at Clara and telling her she had no other place to go, that she would eventually come crawling back because the frontier had no mercy for women alone. But Clara surprised everyone including herself when she stepped forward and said she would rather face the wilderness than live one day under a man who treated her with such cruelty. And for a moment the entire ranch yard fell silent except for the restless shifting of horses, and Harold's smile slowly disappeared as humiliation replaced his confidence, yet instead of accepting defeat he reached for his revolver in a sudden burst of anger. a mistake that sealed his fate in the blink of an eye because Daniel Cross had spent half his life surviving dangerous men on the frontier, and before Harold's gun even cleared its holster Daniel's revolver was already pointed straight at his chest, the message clear without a single word spoken, and Harold froze, realizing the lonely cowboy standing before him was not a man easily intimidated, and after a tense moment he spat curses into the snow before turning his horse around and riding away with his companions, their figures shrinking into the distance while the cold wind carried the last echoes of their anger across the valley. And when the riders finally disappeared, Clara felt her legs weaken from the rush of emotion she had been holding back for days, yet Daniel simply holstered his gun and told her she had done the hardest thing a person could do on the frontier, which was standing up for herself. And as the weeks passed, the ranch slowly transformed from a place of loneliness into something warmer and more alive than Daniel ever expected, because Clara's presence filled the house with laughter, music from an old piano that had not been touched in years, and small acts of kindness that reminded Daniel life could still hold beauty even after unbearable loss, and the townspeople eventually began hearing stories about the mysterious woman who had chosen to stay at Daniel Cross's ranch not as a servant or burden but as an equal partner in rebuilding a life neither of them had planned. And one quiet evening, as the sun set behind the mountains painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel found Clara standing near the fence watching the horses run across the open fields, and he realized something that both frightened and amazed him, because the emptiness he had carried for so long was finally fading, replaced by a feeling he thought he had buried forever. And when Clara turned to thank him once again for saving her that night by the old stage stop, Daniel shook his head gently and said the truth was she had saved him too, because sometimes the loneliest hearts are the ones most in need of unexpected company. And as they stood there watching the endless plains stretching toward the horizon, both of them understood that the strange accident which brought them together had quietly turned into something far greater than survival. It had become the beginning of a family neither of them believed they would ever have again, proving that even in the harshest corners of the Wild West, fate sometimes delivers the greatest gifts in the most unexpected ways. And if you enjoyed this powerful story of courage, love, and second chances on the Wild West frontier, make sure you subscribe to the channel and join us for more unforgettable cowboy stories, because the next tale might be even more shocking than this one.